The way Genshin likes to go about releasing new characters is rather cyclical in nature. Not entirely sure if that's intentional or coincidence, but either way, it's allowed them to maintain a steady power scaling even though year 3 is around the time when the power creep starts to become very noticeable for gacha games. To be fair, Genshin is still experiencing some semblance of it. Most of the version 1 units who weren't at the very top of the pyramid are showing a very serious decline from their already tenuous position. But comparatively, MiHoYo has been careful not to push the envelope too far too often. Prior to Nahida, the last quote-unquote meta-breaking unit was Yelan, who succeeded Raiden Shogun and Kokomi several versions prior. It's safe to say the game introduces a tier 0 unit every 4 to 6 months give or take. A lot of discussion was thrown around Yelan prior to her banner being instated. I myself made a video on whether or not her release marks a turning point for the game. In fact, I don't think there is any 5-star who is more divisive on if players should go out of their way for. Normally the sentiment for any 5-star is either a definitive yes or a no, at least in terms of the necessity of pulling for them. Obviously no 5-star is an absolute necessity, Genshin is free to play, but you get what I mean. 6 months have passed, and during that period, Yelan's proved her usefulness time and time again, even in spite of the predisposition players had for her. So, in today's episode of Why Everyone Plays, let's talk about Yelan. Something I find interesting about Yelan is that her situation is unlike any other top tier 5-star character in Genshin, as she was the only one who, for all intents and purposes, was waving a giant flag in the air saying, "Hey, I'm overpowered," without any ambiguity, yet there was still a decent number of players who were on the fence about going for her even if they had the means and wherewithal to do so. Despite all that discourse, Yelan's arrival ranks in the top 5 best-selling banners of all time, and I know for a fact she was responsible for more than 85% of those sales, as Xiao already had a rerun a few months before that. It just goes to show you how meteoric her presence was overall, especially for a character who didn't fit either of the two criterias that other top tiers did before her. At least I don't think. In a way, her situation mirrors Ayaka's. Both had to contend with an already existing hallmark in their element, Ayaka with Ganyu and Yelan with Xingqiu. If we take into consideration the limited resources of a free-to-play player, while it would be nice to have multiple copies so to speak, it's more prudent for them to go for a unit that fills a niche they don't have yet. As an analogy, having 2 spoons is better than 1, but if you don't have a fork, you should probably get that instead, even if you really want that second spoon. Ayaka was able to overcome this obstacle through sheer appeal, and I guess to a lesser extent her early timeline. As the unit we've known before Genshin was even released, the anticipation drove a massive number of players to dump all their primo gems on her even if they already had Ganyu, Diona, so on and so forth. Moreover, there was still an absence of an all-purpose melee cryo DPS, as every close quarters fighter before her was either a support or Eula, the latter being a cryo unit in name only. So Ayaka still managed to find a spot that had yet to be released. Yelan wasn't quite the same. In terms of Hydra support, we already had a serviceable roster. Kokomi and Barba took care of all need for sustenance, Mona was your tactical vaporized nuke, and Xingqiu covered more bases for Hydro than Bennett did Pyro, supplying you with virtually all Hydro-related benefits, damage, defense, reactions, what have you. Moreover, in terms of range pressure, Child was already in the game. At first glance, there appeared to be no practical area of expertise that wasn't taken. Additionally, just before her, Kokomi and Ayato's banners were released back to back, offering 2 very powerful Hydro units to anyone lacking in them. Circumstantially, Yelan's banner had every reason to fail. The success of top tier units that came before or since were primarily driven by equal parts efficiency and necessity. Huta was the first widely available Pyro on-field DPS, given that Diluc never had his own banner. Zhongli, Shogun, and Nahida had a similar situation. Before we saw her numbers, everyone theorized that Yelan was good, but ultimately a luxury, one that you could pass if you had Xingqiu. The irony is that while the consensus on Yelan is that she's more situational than Xingqiu, her usage has consistently been higher than his, at least in Spiral Abyss, which again I know isn't everything, but I wouldn't be surprised if she was used more in the overworld as well. Then again, perhaps Yelan was able to find a niche of her own, just like Ayaka. Ganyu and Xingqiu are incredibly valuable units by virtue of their general coverage. They offer a lot of everything, but it also means they may not truly excel in one aspect or another since their power budget is split across multiple things. What would happen if someone had a comparable power budget and invested all of it into one area? That's what Yelan was able to accomplish, on top of, being extremely marketable. She gets a lot of fan art. If I could describe why everyone plays Yelan in one sentence, it would go something like this. She takes all of the beneficial properties of Hydro and weaponizes them in a way that tailors to what the average player wants to achieve. What are the beneficial properties of Hydro exactly? To start, The element is associated with HP for scaling more than any other. While it isn't an offensive stat like Elemental Mastery or Energy Recharge, more health implies a more forgiving margin for error. It's one of the reasons Hu Tao is so good. She's super tanky and deals a lot of damage. Curious about Yelan is that her talents only scale off of health, no base attack scaling to speak of, so she's not actually a hybrid scaler, she only scales off of one attribute. And health is very easy to come by in artifacts, as I'm sure you all know. This also means she doesn't require any sorts of healing due to being naturally tanky. Second, Hydro is arguably the most fluid element in regards to driving, being the complement to some of the game's most popular reactions: Electrocharge, Freeze, Bloom, and Vaporize. She may not be as efficient as some other Hydro units in this field, but she does enough to fulfill all your needs, without making you sacrifice DPS or field time to do so. In fact, she can do a crap ton of damage with Vaporize through a lingering lifeline, which I'll get into later. Third, Hydro is a very hands-off element, with its units not demanding too much field time, therefore making them extremely efficient. Yelan is also a very low maintenance character, and what little field time she does need is put to good use because of her rather strong burst damage. By burst I mean like front-loaded damage, not her elemental burst, although we will talk about that. So since Yelan is a 5-star, that also gives her a bigger power budget than her 4-star counterpart. I would say Xingqiu is still the best unit in the game overall for how accessible, comfortable, and versatile he is, but if we go by sheer offensive capability, his 4-star position definitely works against him. Depth Clearing Dice is a near carbon copy of Raincutter. Both instantiate a singularity that accompanies the active character, echoing their normal attacks with a flurry of Hydro damage. While Raincutter's damage is very impressive, dealing an average of about 300 to 400% per wave, it's still based on his attack, which you won't have too much of unless you specifically opt for an attack-focused build. For the average person, Xingqiu's 4-star base stats and most comfortable weapon being Sacrificial Sword, his attack power won't be that great, and so his DPS isn't as good as it could be since you're focusing on energy recharge and the like. Make no mistake though, he's still broken as hell. Yelan, on the other hand, scales off of HP, a metric that's a lot easier to work with. For those who got her weapon as well as her, Aqua Simulacra offers a staggering 88.2% bonus crit damage and increases her max HP by 16% and total damage by 20% even while off-field. The attack won't be factored into the equation, but these offensive stats provide more in DPS than a Sacrificial Sword would for Xingqiu. Speaking of offense, unlike other characters who only have a small portion of their health converted to damage, Yelan's conversion is quite impressive. A single burst of Lingering Lifeline does 40.7% of her max health at rank 10, and each wave of her burst will do just over 24% or 38% with Constellation 2. Now the downside to her talents not scaling off of any attack whatsoever is that there are more buffs to attack than there are to HP. For example, her damage won't increase from Bennett. At the same time, she doesn't need it. This is the first instance where it makes perfect sense for miHoYo to restrict a character's capabilities, because if she could take advantage of attack boosts, she would be disgustingly overpowered. However, a positive consequence of Yelan's exclusive HP scaling is that 4-star weapons are just as effective on her as 5-stars. Better yet, 3-star weapons can be just as good on her because the only thing that matters is the substat and weapon passive. But assuming you're using her signature weapon, the extreme crit damage pairs very nicely with her crit rate ascension stat, making her very strong right out the gate. Doesn't take a lot of investment from your artifacts to make her good. As if that wasn't enough, they decided to give her quite possibly one of the most broken talents in the game, Adapt with Ease. While her elemental burst is in effect, the active character's damage continuously increases by 1 at base plus 3.5% per second up to a total of 50. Mathematically, I think it averages out to around like 30% throughout the 15 seconds. But if you keep track of how long the buff is out for, you can supercharge your main DPS for the latter half of its duration, providing an unconditional 30% plus bonus damage along with the damage coming from her own abilities. That's almost on par with the attack boost you get from Bennett. Basically, her 5-star status gives her the privilege of 5-star numbers. You wouldn't be able to see this on a 4-star. More importantly, she focuses all of her pressure into offense, pure DPS, allowing you to squeeze more from her than you would from Xingqiu. Just like how Ayaka forfeits crowd control, massive area coverage, and the consistent cryo application that Ganyu provides, Yelan trades the damage reduction, healing, and super armor that Xingqiu brings in exchange for being effectively a hybrid between him and Bennett. She has the Hydro follow-up damage that Xingqiu has, and the incredible damage amp from Bennett. Only in this case, her damage boost works for everyone, not just attack scalers. I think you can guess why people like her so much. Yelan is Xingqiu with more damage. If I remember correctly, Theory Crafters calculated that base Yelan with Aqua Simulacra slightly edges out a max Constellation Xingqiu with Primordial Jade Cutter, meaning any constellations or optimizations you give to her will allow her to outclass her 4-star counterpart. Let's actually go through constellations. Another privilege of being a 5-star is that your constellations are actually good, most of the time anyway. C1 slashes her energy cost a ton by letting her store 2 charges of Lingering Lifeline that also doubles her 40% max health damage to 80%. Constellation 2 causes her Elemental Burst to send 4 Hydro Balls instead of 3, increasing her Hydro application to the same level as Xingqiu's. Constellation 4 can boost her entire party's max HP by up to 40% if she hits at least 4 enemies with her skill, another fantastic buff that ramps up her DPS and the survivability of her entire team. Ironically, I find Constellation 6 to be the worst in my opinion. It essentially allows her next 5 normal attacks after using Depth Clearing Dice to deal the equivalent of 1.5 times the damage of her Breakthrough Charge attack. It's a shitload of damage, mind you, but Yelan's main job is off-field pressure anyway, so this only works if you love her enough to want her to be an on-field DPS. Constellations for 5 stars are usually seen as a bad thing for most people, and any benefits they provide should not be taken into consideration for judging the value of their performance. I agree with that for characters who feel like they need those constellations to make up for deficiencies. Kind of like how Yaemiko has an unjustifiably high cost burst, and her first constellation brings that to a more reasonable level, but it's not like she would be overpowered if her base energy cost was just lower to begin with. In Yelan's case, she's entirely playable at base, and the majority of her strengths are as well. The constellations serve to increase her ceiling, not raise her floor, if that makes sense, and by no small amount either. All of her constellations improve her efficiency significantly because of how strong her baseline is. Of course, no 5-star is without weaknesses, and Yelan does have a few noteworthy ones. However, all of those weaknesses are not only able to be supplemented externally, but the trade-off is very worth it. That's what matters. Having deficiencies in a character is not a bad thing in and of itself. It's if you have to expend too many resources to make up for it. It's entirely possible for you to make Xinyan or Amber a strong character and playable, but the amount of hoops you have to jump through to do so just isn't worth it. Yelan has 2 key weaknesses, the first being her energy requirements. She's very demanding, especially with that Constellation 1. Lingering Lifeline is a solid battery, but you will need to augment in other areas to have maximum uptime on her burst. Fortunately, Yelan has the luxury to itemize a support bow like Bavonius or Sacrificial, since once again, she doesn't have to care about her weapon's attack value at all. Furthermore, the absurdly high crit value tied to her base properties gives you the freedom to spec more upgrades into energy recharge, or you can just run an ER main stat hourglass if you want. There's also Emblem of Severed Fate, there's also Raiden Shogun, there's also Double Hydro. It's easier to supplement energy costs than damage, empirically speaking. Her other weakness is of course the fact that she doesn't offer any protection whatsoever. The good news is healing and shielding are a dime a dozen. It's not that hard to keep yourself safe. In the overworld, you also have access to food items for healing. And lest we forget, you can also just, dodge. I know, Zhongli made all of us bad at the game, but in all seriousness, Yelan's elemental skill gives her the fastest grounded movement in the game, albeit for a short time. If you know the enemy's attack patterns, you can reposition quickly with her. Besides, she does just enough damage to afford you the luxury of a defensive support. But it's not like enemies or bosses one-shot you anyway. The single biggest reason why Yelan is so popular is that at the end of the day, she's an alternative to Xingqiu, who is the best unit in the game. I think ever since Dendro, Xingqiu officially takes the crown away from Bennett as number 1. So for like Spiral Abyss, you can effectively have Xingqiu on both teams, or you can have Xingqiu and Yelan on one team for big dig damage. Unless you're fighting a Hydro immune boss, you can take any 2 characters, slap them with those 2, and the game becomes Minecraft peaceful mode. While I did spend most of the video talking about reasons why Yelan is quote-unquote better than Xingqiu, there's no rule saying you can't use both of them on one team, and many do. In fact, Yelan's at her best when paired with them. If you had to choose between one or the other though, I find myself using Yelan more often. That's mostly because her elemental skill is the greatest thing since sliced bread for overworld exploration, and I do prefer Lingering Lifeline over Fatal Rain Screen for the lower cooldown and crowd control provided. All in all though, Yelan is an offensive-oriented character who not only packs enough benefits to that offense, but chooses weaknesses that can easily be made up for without hindering your party's total efficiency to the point where it cancels out those benefits. She's part of the right element to pull this off, and has the right forms of pressure. Quick attacks on field, and amazing off-field damage. Exclusive scaling, meaning she doesn't have to care about weapons and artifacts as much as others. Very generous numbers, and fantastic constellations. She's just a good character, and a testament to how strong Hydro is as an element. I don't think there's any other element that has more tier 0 characters with equal performance than Hydro. I should probably make a video on it, huh? Anyways, that's gonna be it for today. TLDR, those of you who skipped Yelan, make sure you save up for her on her rerun, you're missing out. Let me know your thoughts on her in the comments down below if you agree or disagree with my points. But if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe, really helps the channel out. Also, consider following me on Twitter, joining my Discord server, and checking out my Why Everyone Plays episode on Ayaka if you haven't yet. Till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon in the next one. Take care.